A little girl dragged the mountain man to an abandoned cabin, and what was inside changed everything. Snow whips across the ridge. A lonely cabin stands silent, its roof half fallen, its windows black voids. The gruff mountain man, Mateo, thinks it's just another ruin until the child pushes open the door. On the hearth lies a Bible, deeds, and a map pointing to a spring that could save or destroy the whole valley. But word spreads fast. Hoof beats thunder in the night. A deputy with cold eyes and a railroad boss hungry for land will burn anything to claim that water. The cabin becomes a battleground of faith, fire, and frontier justice. The child clings to hope, whispering prayers in the smoke-filled air. The mountain man, scarred by a loss that drove him into the mountains, must decide. Will he fight for her future, or will he let the past bury them both? The church bell tolls, guns flash in the dark. The spring's promise is life itself. The bitter wind whipped across Mateo Hale's face as he trudged through knee-deep snow, his gaze fixed on the trap line, stretching into the growing storm. His weathered hands, shielded only by worn leather gloves, trembled as he found another empty trap. "Nothing again," he muttered, the words swallowed by the wind. The solitude of the high country usually brought him a rough sort of peace, but today the emptiness was a physical weight, pressing in like the heavy gray clouds overhead. The trap line was his life, a silent conversation with the wilderness. But the wilderness had fallen silent. The snow was coming down thicker now, blurring the edges of the pines, erasing the world. Mateo adjusted his wool scarf and pulled his coat tighter, a familiar debate starting in his mind. Turn back. In 15 years of living alone in these mountains, he'd learned to read the weather's moods. This storm had an ugly look to it, a mean streak. It wasn't just snow, it was a warning, a flash of movement in the trees. Mateo's hand instinctively went to the rifle slung across his back, his muscles tensing for a threat. But he froze. A small figure, hardly more than a wisp in ragged clothes, burst from the dense pines. It was a child, charging straight at him through the deep snow with a terrifying urgency. Before he could even step back, tiny, shockingly strong hands seized his arm. He found himself staring down into a pair of desperate blue eyes set in a dirt-smudged face. "Please," the girl gasped, her breath forming frantic clouds in the frigid air. "Please, mister, you have to come with me." Mateo tried to gentle his normally gruff voice, a tool he rarely used. "Now hold on there, little one. Where'd you come from? Where are your folks?" But she didn't answer. She just tugged harder on his arm, her small body straining with the effort. "There's no time," she insisted, her voice raw. "The snow's covering everything up. Please, you have to help me find it before it's all buried." Something in her tone, a cocktail of raw fear and fierce determination, stirred memories Mateo kept locked away in the darkest corners of his mind. He looked down at her thin frame, at the clothes far too light for this weather. Her dark hair was a tangled mess of pine needles, and her boots looked worn nearly through. He could see the cold seeping into her very bones. "Find what?" he asked, but she was already pulling him forward, leading him with the single-minded focus of a child on a sacred mission. "This way," she insisted, pulling him off the familiar path of his trapline and into the thick, dark timber. Mateo's every instinct screamed at him to resist, to turn back toward the relative safety of his cabin before the storm swallowed them both. But the girl's grip was like iron, a desperate anchor, and he found himself following her deeper and deeper into the forest. The wind grew fiercer, a living thing that shrieked through the trees, driving ice crystals against their faces. They pushed through the deepening snow, a man and a child against the fury of the mountain. "Name's Mateo," he offered, the words nearly stolen by the wind. "Mateo Hale. You got a name, child?" "Ava," she answered, never looking back, her attention locked on navigating the treacherous terrain. "Just a little further, Mr. Hale. It's right past these big cottonwoods." They emerged into a small clearing where a line of massive cottonwood trees had fallen, their ancient trunks forming a tangled, skeletal barrier. And half hidden behind the fallen giants, Mateo saw it, the dark, brooding shape of a cabin. Snow had drifted high against its walls and piled on its partially collapsed roof, suggesting it had stood abandoned for a very long time. Ava's pace quickened as she led him around the fallen trees, her small form moving with a desperate energy. "This was our home," she said, her voice catching for just a moment. "Mine and Pa's." Mateo studied the cabin with the experienced eyes of a man who knew what the mountains could do to things left untended. The log walls were solid enough, but the weather had taken its toll, scarring the wood and prying at the seams. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and through a broken window he could see that snow had blown inside, a white shroud over whatever was left. "Your pa around?" Mateo asked carefully, though he already suspected the answer from the way she said was. Ava's small shoulders slumped. "He's with Jesus now," she said quietly, her voice so soft he almost missed it. "But he left something important here, something I have to find." Mateo's heart, a thing he'd long considered hardened against the pain of others, gave an uncomfortable twinge. He knew too well how loss could hollow a person out, leaving nothing but empty spaces where warmth and life used to be, especially the loss of family. "Let's have a look then," he said, moving past her to push open the groaning, creaking door. "But we'll need to make it quick. This storm's getting worse." Inside, the cabin was a study in abandonment. A fine layer of snow dusted everything. The rough-hewn table, the rustic chairs, the cold, dead hearth. Weak, gray light filtered through the holes in the roof, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. The air was thick with the musty smell of decay and disuse, the scent of forgotten memories. Ava darted past him, her worn boots making no sound on the snow-covered floorboards. She went straight for the stone fireplace. "Help me look," she said, dropping to her knees beside the hearth, her small hands already probing the cold stones. "Pa said he put them somewhere safe, somewhere dry." Mateo moved closer, watching her frantic search. "What exactly are we looking for?" "Papers," she answered, her voice tight with concentration, not pausing in her examination. "Important papers. Pa said they would protect the spring. And his Bible. He never went anywhere without his Bible." Mateo's interest sharpened at the mention of a spring. Water rights were precious in this valley, a currency often worth more than gold. A reliable spring could make a man rich or start a war. He joined her search, his large, calloused hands checking the corners and crevices around the fireplace, feeling for anything out of place. "Here!" Ava's excited cry drew his attention. She had found a loose stone near the base of the hearth. With a grunt of effort, she pried it free, revealing a small, dark cavity behind it. And within that space, protected from the damp, lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. With trembling fingers, Ava pulled the package out and carefully unwrapped it on the cold hearth. Inside, Mateo could see yellowed papers, their edges crisp despite the years of neglect. A well-worn Bible lay on top, its leather cover scratched and scarred but intact. "Pa's Bible," Ava whispered, running her fingers reverently over the cover, as if touching a holy relic. She opened it carefully, revealing spidery, faded handwriting on the flyleaf. "See," she said, her small finger tracing the words. "It says, 'Property of Thomas Whittam.' That's my pa." Mateo leaned closer, his eyes scanning the other papers. His breath caught in his throat. He recognized legal documents, property deeds, and water rights filings. And there, carefully folded and reinforced with strips of cloth at its creases, was a map. "Your pa was Thomas Whittam?" Mateo asked, the pieces of a half-forgotten puzzle clicking into place in his mind. He'd heard the rumors in town, whispers about Whittam's claim to a legendary spring high in the mountains. A spring that never ran dry. But the man had vanished months ago during the fever, and with him, any proof of ownership. Ava nodded, clutching the heavy Bible to her chest as if it were a shield. "He always said the spring was God's gift," she said, her voice filled with a fierce pride. "Meant to be shared with everyone, not just the rich folks down in the valley." Her voice grew softer, shadowed with a pain that was too big for her small body. "But then the fever came, and Pa said I had to hide until it was safe, until I found someone trustworthy to help." Mateo sat back on his heels, the cold of the floor seeping through his trousers, studying the small, determined figure before him. She looked half-starved and utterly exhausted, but her eyes held a strength that spoke of survival against impossible odds. How long had she been alone, hiding in these mountains? How had a child managed to stay alive in this unforgiving wilderness? The wind howled outside, rattling the loose boards of the cabin like a hungry ghost. Mateo knew they couldn't stay. The storm was building to a fury that would soon make travel impossible, trapping them in this ruin. But he couldn't leave her, not with night coming on and the temperature dropping like a stone. "We need to get you somewhere warm," he said, standing up, his joints creaking in protest. "My cabin's not far. Maybe an hour's walk if we hurry." Ava looked up at him, her small face a mask of uncertainty, clutching the precious bundle of papers. "Can I trust you, Mr. Hale? Pa said I had to be sure before I showed anyone the papers." Mateo met her gaze steadily, letting her see the truth in his own tired eyes. "I reckon your pa was right about being careful. There's folks in this valley who'd do anything to get their hands on water rights like these." He paused, choosing his next words with a care he hadn't used in years. "I can't promise to fix everything, but I give you my word. I'll help you figure out what's right." Something in his tone, perhaps the echo of his own long-buried grief, must have convinced her. Ava nodded once, a small, decisive gesture, and carefully rewrapped the papers in the oilcloth. Mateo helped her secure the bundle inside her worn coat, then led her toward the cabin door. As they stepped back into the swirling, blinding snow, Mateo felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders, heavier than his pack, colder than the wind. This child's trust was a burden he hadn't sought, a complication he didn't want. But now that it was given, he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he couldn't ignore it. Her father's papers could change everything in the valley, and there were powerful, ruthless people who wouldn't want that change. People who would crush a little girl to get what they wanted. Mateo took Ava's small, cold hand in his as they began the trek through the deepening snow. The wind cut through his coat, a razor-sharp blade against his skin, but he barely noticed the cold. His mind was already racing, working through the implications of what they'd found, of the promise he'd just made. The papers hidden against Ava's chest carried more than just legal claims. They carried hope for justice, and perhaps something even more precious: the chance for two lonely, broken souls to find a family again. The storm howled outside Mateo's cabin, rattling the shutters against their frames as if demanding entry. Inside, the warm glow of a coal oil lantern cast dancing shadows on the log walls. Mateo had spread the rescued papers across his rough-hewn table, each document a ghost from another life. Beside him, Ava stood on tiptoe, her small hands gripping the table's edge, her eyes wide as she watched him examine each one. "Pa always kept these safe," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the wind's shriek. "He said they were more precious than gold." Mateo nodded, his focus on the weathered deed. The paper was yellowed with age, but Thomas Whittam had preserved it well, the oilcloth wrapping protecting it from moisture and wear. His calloused fingers traced the carefully penned script, noting the official seal in the corner, the crisp signatures. "Your father was a careful man," Mateo observed, studying Thomas Whittam's distinctive looping mark at the bottom of the deed. "Everything's properly signed and witnessed." Ava's face brightened at the praise for her father. "He taught me my letters using that Bible," she said, her hand reaching for the worn leather book. "We'd read together every night after supper." Mateo watched as she opened the Bible with a reverent care that spoke of deep love. The flyleaf bore a family record in neat, precise handwriting. Thomas Whittam, married to Sarah Miller Whittam. And below that, their daughter, Ava Grace Whittam, born in the spring of 1872. But it was the dates below that made Mateo's throat tighten. Sarah Whittam died of fever, April 12, 1878. And just 3 days later, Thomas Whittam died of fever, April 15, 1878. The same year, he did the math in his head, a cold dread creeping into his heart. April was months ago. "You've been alone since spring?" Mateo asked, his voice rough with a disbelief that bordered on horror. Ava nodded, her small finger tracing the names in the Bible as if she could feel their presence in the ink. "Pa told me to hide in the woods if anything happened to him. He said there were folks who'd try to take advantage if they knew I was by myself." She looked up at Mateo then, her blue eyes holding a wisdom far too old for her young face. "I'm good at hiding. And I learned how to check traps without springing them. Mateo's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He'd wondered why some of his traps had been emptied these past few months. He'd blamed a clever fox, a wolverine. The thought of this child, this slip of a girl, surviving alone in the harsh wilderness, stealing morsels from his own traps just to stay alive, made his chest ache with a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. A fierce, protective anger. "Show me the map," he said gruffly, pushing away the wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. Ava carefully unfolded the creased paper. The map was hand-drawn but detailed, showing the ridge lines and valleys Mateo knew as well as his own face. Near the top of a remote ridge, a spring was marked with careful precision, along with notes about water flow and seasonal changes. "Pa said the spring never runs dry," Ava explained, her finger tracing the blue line that snaked from the spring down toward the valley. "Even in the worst drought, it keeps flowing. That's why he knew it was special, a blessing meant to be shared." Mateo knew the spring she spoke of. He'd stumbled across it on his hunting trips, a clear, cold stream of water bursting from the rocky mountainside. He'd assumed it was unclaimed, like most of the high country water sources. But if Thomas Whittam had filed a proper claim? A loud, insistent growl from Ava's stomach interrupted his thoughts. The child blushed a deep crimson, wrapping her thin arms around her middle as if to quiet the protest. "When's the last time you ate proper?" Mateo asked, his voice softer than he intended, already moving toward his meager stores. "I found some berries yesterday," Ava answered quietly, "and I had a piece of jerky the day before." Mateo's jaw tightened as he pulled out the last of his salt pork and a handful of dried apples. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He set about preparing a simple meal, heating water for tea, slicing the pork thin to make it stretch further. Ava ate like someone who had known true, gnawing hunger, carefully but quickly, making sure not a single crumb was wasted. Mateo found himself pushing more of the small portions her way, his own appetite gone, diminished by the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders. As night deepened and the storm outside showed no signs of letting up, Mateo laid out his bedroll near the warmth of the fireplace. He offered Ava his only blanket, but she shook her head, her eyes wide in the flickering firelight. "Could I, could I sleep close to you?" she asked, her voice hesitant, small. "Like Pa used to let me when it stormed." Mateo's heart clenched at the request. The words were a ghost from his past. How many nights had his own daughter, Sarah, curled against him during thunderstorms, her small body finding safety in his presence? The memory, long buried under years of grief and solitude, surfaced with a surprising, painful clarity. "Come on, then," he said gruffly, lifting the edge of the heavy wool blanket. Ava settled beside him, her small body curled like a comma against his side. The familiar weight, the innocent warmth, stirred memories he had thought were safely buried forever. His wife, Mary, singing their daughter to sleep, the sound of small feet running across wooden floors, the feel of tiny arms wrapped around his neck in unconditional trust and love. Sleep eluded him as the storm raged on. In the darkness, Mateo's mind wandered back to that terrible night 8 years ago, when a rogue fire had claimed his family and his faith in one cruel, swift sweep. He had retreated to the high country afterward, choosing the cold embrace of solitude over the risk of ever caring for anyone again. But now, listening to Ava's steady rhythmic breathing beside him, Mateo felt something shift deep in his chest. The thick wall he had so carefully built around his heart developed a hairline crack, letting in a single terrifying feeling he'd long forgotten existed. Hope. Morning brought a temporary lull in the storm. The wind quieted its howling, and a pale light filtered through the cabin's single window. Mateo woke to find Ava already up, her small, cold, numb fingers fumbling to restart the fire. He showed her how to lay the kindling properly, his large hands guiding hers as she struck the flint and steel together. "We'll need more wood," he said, eyeing his depleting woodpile. "This storm might last another day or two." Together they ventured out into the knee-deep, silent snow. Mateo showed Ava how to test fallen logs for dryness, how to carry them safely. She worked without a single complaint, her quiet determination evident in every small step she took through the deep snow. As they stacked the gathered wood inside the cabin, Mateo found himself studying the child. She had Thomas Whittam's straight nose and determined chin, but her eyes held a spark of something else. A quiet resilience that spoke of her mother's strength, perhaps. "Those papers," Mateo said finally, breaking the comfortable silence that had grown between them. "They could mean trouble. There's powerful men down in the valley who won't take kindly to someone claiming water rights they thought were free for the taking." Ava paused in her wood stacking, her gaze meeting his steadily. "Pa said the same thing. That's why he made me promise to be careful who I trusted with the secret." Mateo nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her trust settle more firmly onto his soul. "Reckon we'll need to look into these claims proper-like. Make sure everything's legal and binding." He hesitated, the next words feeling foreign on his tongue. "And until we do, you'll stay here, where it's safe." The smile that broke across Ava's face was like the sun breaking through storm clouds, warming places in Mateo's heart he thought were forever frozen. He turned away quickly to hide his own expression, busying himself with the fire. "First things first," he said gruffly. "We need to get this cabin properly warm and see about fixing some breakfast. Can't think straight on an empty stomach." As he worked alongside the child, showing her how to bank the fire and heat water for coffee, weak tea for her, Mateo felt the stirring of something he'd long forgotten. A purpose. These papers, this child's trust. They were a responsibility he hadn't sought, but one he knew he could no longer ignore. He watched as Ava carefully returned the papers to their oilcloth wrapping, handling them with a reverence that spoke of their immense importance to her. They weren't just legal documents. They were her heritage, her father's legacy, and perhaps her only chance at a future. The storm outside gathered its strength again, the wind beginning to moan in the chimney. But inside the cabin, something else was building. A cautious, fragile bond between two wounded souls, and the first tentative steps toward healing for them both. The morning dawned crisp and bright, the storm finally spent, leaving the world blanketed in pristine white. Mateo rose early, checking his meager supplies while Ava still slept, a small lump under his heaviest blanket. His line shack, a full day's ride through the deep snow, offered better shelter and more provisions than this crumbling, forgotten cabin. He gathered what remained of his food and gently woke the child. "Time to move on," he said, his voice soft, watching her rub the sleep from her eyes. "Got a proper place up higher. It's safer there." Ava nodded quickly, her movements efficient as she rolled up her father's papers and tucked them securely inside her worn coat. She moved with the quiet competence of someone used to leaving places behind, though her small hands shook slightly from the cold. Outside, Mateo's mule, a sturdy, sure-footed beast named Jed, stamped impatiently in the fresh snow. The going would be slow with two riders in the deep drifts. He helped Ava mount, then swung up behind her, the old leather of the saddle creaking a familiar complaint. "Hold tight to the pommel," he instructed, wrapping his heavy coat around her small frame as best he could. "The trail's rough in places." They set out as the sun climbed higher, Jed picking his way carefully through snow-choked paths. Mateo kept them to the timberline where possible, using the dense pines for shelter against the bitter, biting wind. Ava sat quietly at first, a small, still presence in front of him. But as the morning wore on, her natural curiosity got the better of her. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked, her voice carrying back to him on the still air. 8 years, Mateo answered shortly, guiding Jed around a massive fallen pine. "All by yourself?" "Yep. Don't you get lonely?" Mateo's hands tightened on the reins. It was a question no one had asked him in a very long time, a question he never asked himself. "I got used to it," he said, his tone meant to end the conversation. But Ava wasn't deterred by his brief, clipped responses. "Pa said people weren't meant to be alone," she said, her voice full of simple conviction. "Said it right there in Genesis. It is not good for man to be alone." Mateo grunted, uncomfortable with how close her innocent words struck to the hollow place in his own heart. "Your pa read the Bible much?" "Every night," Ava said proudly. "He said it was more important than bread." She paused thoughtfully. "Though bread's awful important too." Despite himself, Mateo felt a small smile tug at the corners of his lips. The child had a way of stating plain, simple truths that cut right through the carefully constructed wall of his solitude. By midday, both riders and mule were in need of rest. Mateo found a sheltered spot beneath a stand of thick pines and helped Ava dismount. Her legs were stiff and cold from the long ride, and she stumbled slightly in the deep snow. "Let's get a fire going," he said, noting the way she hugged herself tightly for warmth. He cleared snow from a patch of ground while Ava, unasked, began gathering dry pine needles and small twigs. She watched intently as he expertly built the fire, asking questions about each step, her sharp mind absorbing everything. The flames caught quickly, and soon they were huddled close, sharing the last of Mateo's jerky and drinking hot, weak tea from a tin cup. "Were you always a mountain man?" Ava asked, her blue eyes fixed on his face as she warmed her small hands by the fire. Mateo stared into the dancing flames, the question stirring a past he kept buried deep. "No," he said, his voice low. "Used to have a ranch down in the valley. What happened to it?" The question was innocent, but it landed like a physical blow. "Fire," he said shortly, the single word thick with a world of pain. "Fire took it, along with everything else." Ava was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with those unnervingly wise eyes. "Is that why you came up here?" she asked softly. "To get away from the memories?" Mateo stood abruptly, the sudden movement scattering sparks from the fire. He stamped it out with his boot, leaving a dark, steaming patch in the snow. "Time to move on," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. The afternoon passage was slower, the trail growing steeper as they climbed higher into the mountains. Ava dozed occasionally, her small head leaning back against Mateo's chest. He found himself automatically adjusting his grip to keep her secure, old protective instincts he thought long dead surfacing without his permission. It was nearly sunset when they finally reached his line shack. The sturdy log structure stood defiant against the mountainside, a thin curl of smoke still rising from its stone chimney where he had banked the fire before leaving 2 days ago. Ava's eyes widened as they entered. It's, it's like a real house," she breathed. Mateo surveyed his home through her eyes. The pot-bellied stove radiating a faint warmth, the neat stack of split wood, the single bunk with its bearskin blanket, the shelves of preserved food and tools. Simple comforts he'd long taken for granted now seemed like unimaginable luxuries. "You've got a stove and everything," Ava marveled, moving closer to its warmth, her hands outstretched. "Pa always wanted to get one, but they cost too dear." Mateo busied himself with starting supper, setting beans to soak and mixing cornmeal for bread. Ava watched his every movement, a quiet shadow in the small cabin. The familiar routine of his solitary life felt strange with an audience, but not, he was surprised to find, unpleasant. As the beans simmered and the cornbread baked, filling the shack with a comforting aroma, Ava pulled out her father's Bible. The leather cover was worn smooth with use, its pages dog-eared and marked. Would you, would you read some?" she asked hesitantly. "Pa always read before supper." Mateo stared at the book, the request a punch to his gut. He remembered other evenings, other readings. His wife, Mary, had been the religious one, her quiet faith a constant, gentle presence in their home. After losing her, he'd turned his back on that faith entirely, seeing it as a cruel joke. But Ava's hopeful, expectant expression wore down his resistance. "Just a short bit," he conceded, taking the Bible from her with a strange reluctance. The book fell open to a passage in Psalms, a page marked with a faded ribbon. Mateo's voice, rough from disuse, stumbled over the familiar, beautiful words. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Ava closed her eyes, a look of pure peace on her face, letting the words wash over her. When he finished, she folded her small hands and bowed her head. "Dear Lord," she prayed simply, her voice clear and strong in the quiet cabin. "Thank you for sending Mr. Mateo to help me, and for this warm place to sleep, and for beans and cornbread. Please help Pa and Ma rest peaceful in heaven, and please help Mr. Mateo not be so sad anymore. Amen." Mateo turned quickly to check the beans, his throat tight with an unexpected, overwhelming emotion. The child's simple, honest faith, her easy inclusion of him in her prayers, stirred something long buried in his heart. Meanwhile, As darkness settled like a heavy blanket over the mountains, another scene was unfolding at the abandoned cabin they had left behind. Jim Tanner, a grizzled old trapper working his way through the high country, spotted the dark smudges of their midday fire against the snow. Curious about any activity in what he'd thought was empty territory, Tanner dismounted and investigated. The cabin's interior showed clear signs of recent use: scattered ashes, fresh boot prints in the dust, and most significantly, several papers left behind in Mateo's haste to leave. Tanner couldn't read well, but he recognized official-looking documents when he saw them. More importantly, he recognized the name Witam. Everyone in the valley remembered Thomas Whittam's bold claims about a never-failing spring and how he and his family had mysteriously disappeared during last year's fever outbreak. Gathering the stray papers, Tanner mounted his horse and turned toward the valley. This news, he knew, would be worth something to certain powerful parties in town. By the time he reached the valley settlement, dawn was just breaking over the eastern ridge. Back in Mateo's cabin, Ava slept soundly in the bunk, wrapped in the heavy bearskin blanket. Mateo sat by the dying fire, watching her peaceful face, her prayer echoing in his mind. He'd forgotten how children could see straight to the heart of things, naming the hidden truths adults tried to hide even from themselves. His sadness. She called it out as simply as naming the color of the sky, and just as simply, she had asked God to help heal it. Mateo wasn't sure he believed in that kind of healing anymore. But as he watched Ava sleep, he felt something shift inside him, a painful cracking, like spring ice breaking up after a long, frozen winter. A log settled in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. Mateo added another piece of wood, careful not to wake his young guest. Tomorrow would bring its own dangers and challenges, but for now his shack felt warmer than it had in years. And it wasn't just from the fire. Morning brought a biting wind and the necessity of fresh tasks. Mateo stood in his doorway, studying the pale winter sky while Ava finished the last of her breakfast cornbread, licking the crumbs from her fingers. "Need to make a supply run," he announced, turning back inside. "Running low on flour, and you could use some proper medicine for that cough, I hear." Ava nodded, brushing crumbs from her worn dress. "Will there be many people in town?" "Some," Mateo said, already gathering his saddlebags. "You stay close to me. Mind what I say, and we'll be fine." The mule picked its way carefully down the treacherous mountain trail, its hooves crunching through ice-crusted snow. Mateo had wrapped Ava in his spare coat, but she still shivered against his chest, a small, fragile bird. The sun climbed higher as they descended, but offered little warmth through the thin, winter-white clouds. "Town's just around this bend," Mateo said as they approached the valley floor. "Remember what I said? Stay close. Mind what you say," Ava repeated dutifully, her small hands tightening on the saddle horn. The settlement of Pine Creek came into view, a rough cluster of wooden buildings straddling the stage road, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys into the crisp morning air. As they rode past the livery stable, heads began to turn. A woman stopped sweeping her porch and stared. "That's the Witam girl," she whispered loudly to her companion, her voice carrying on the still air. "Thomas Witam's daughter? The one with the spring claim?" Another voice cut in from across the street. Mateo felt Ava press closer against him. He fixed his sternest glare on the growing crowd of onlookers, a look that had sent bears scrambling, and most of them scurried back to their business. But the whispers followed them like a trail of smoke, curling down the rutted main street. "Her daddy's land had the water. Thought the fever took them all. The railroad's been eyeing that spring for months." Outside Mason's general store, Mateo helped Ava down from the mule. Her legs were stiff from the cold ride, and she stumbled slightly. He steadied her with a firm, gentle hand on her shoulder. The store's bell jingled as they entered, and they were enveloped by warm air thick with the smell of coffee, leather, and pipe tobacco. Old Tom Mason, the proprietor, looked up from his ledger, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Well now," he said, his weathered face creasing into a kind smile. "What have we here?" "Need some supplies, Tom," Mateo said shortly. "Flour, coffee, a few other things." Of course, of course." Mason came around the counter, his eyes fixed on Ava. And who might this young lady be? Before Mateo could invent a story or deflect the question, Ava spoke up, her voice clear and unafraid. I'm Ava Whittam, sir. Pleased to meet you. Mason's eyebrows shot up, but his smile remained gentle. Thomas Whittam's girl. Why, I remember your father well. A good man, your pa. He reached into a large glass jar on the counter. Here now. Every young lady deserves a treat. Ava's eyes widened at the red and white striped peppermint stick he offered. She glanced up at Mateo, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Thank you kindly, sir, she said, accepting the candy with careful fingers. Mateo began collecting his supplies while Mason chatted amiably with Ava. The old storekeeper's genuine warmth helped ease some of the tension that had been coiled in Mateo's shoulders. But that fragile relief vanished at the sound of spurs jingling in the doorway. Deputy Marshal Clay Darnell filled the entrance, his broad shoulders blocking the light. His silver badge caught the winter sun, winking like a malevolent eye. His sharp, cold eyes took in the scene, lingering on Ava for a long moment before settling on Mateo. Hail, he said, his voice a low drawl, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was more mockery than respect. Didn't expect to see you down from your mountain. His voice carried a note of calculated, insolent courtesy that set Mateo's teeth on edge. Just getting supplies, Mateo replied flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. And who's your young friend? Darnell's gaze shifted back to Ava, who had instinctively moved to stand behind Mateo's leg. No one of consequence to you, deputy. Darnell's smile was a thin, cruel line that didn't reach his eyes. Now, Mateo, everything in this valley is of consequence to the law, particularly when it involves missing heirs and, he paused, letting the word hang in the air, valuable water rights. Mateo moved his body, placing himself squarely between Darnell and Ava. We'll be taking our leave now, Tom, he said, reaching for his coins. Much obliged for the hospitality. Mason nodded, his own friendly expression gone wary and tight. Safe travels to you both. As Mateo helped Ava back onto the mule, he felt Darnell's stare boring into his back like a hot poker. Best watch yourself, Hale, the deputy called after them, his voice laced with venom. It's dangerous country for a man alone, especially one with secrets to keep. Mateo didn't respond, but his jaw clenched so hard he felt a muscle jump. They rode away from town, and the whispers had turned to a heavy, watchful silence, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. They were halfway back to the mountain trail when a flicker of movement in the trees caught Mateo's eye. He tensed, his hand going to his rifle, but relaxed slightly when he recognized the figure that emerged from the pines. Henry, the Apache scout, stepped silently into their path. His dark, intelligent eyes were serious beneath the wide brim of his hat. Mateo had traded with him before, and had always found him fair and direct. Trouble follows you, my friend, Henry said without preamble, his voice low and calm. Mateo reined the mule to a halt. Seems that way. Henry's gaze moved to Ava, then back to Mateo, his expression unreadable. The railroad boss, Mitchell. He speaks often of a spring in the high valley, pure water that never fails, enough to feed his steam engines year-round. He gestured back toward the town. Now, words fly like crows about a girl with a proof of deed to this water. What of it? Mateo's voice was carefully neutral, but his arm tightened protectively around Ava. Mitchell's men will come, Henry said simply. They will not ask for permission. They will not respect paper rights. His expression softened slightly as he looked directly at Ava. The child should be prepared. Mateo nodded slowly. He'd seen enough of the railroad's brutal methods to know that Henry spoke the unvarnished truth. Much obliged for the warning. The old ones say that water is life, Henry continued, his gaze distant. But men like Mitchell see only power. He touched the brim of his hat. Guard her well, friend. Winter storms gather quickly in these mountains. With that, he turned and melted back into the trees as silently as he had appeared. Mateo clicked his tongue, urging the mule forward again, his mind already racing. He was planning defenses, counting his ammunition, considering escape routes. Ava had been quiet through the entire exchange, but now she spoke, her voice soft but clear. Those men, they want my pa's spring, don't they? Seems so. Pa said the spring was God's gift, meant for everyone to share. Her small fingers gripped Mateo's coat tighter. He wouldn't want them to take it just for their trains. Mateo thought of the deputy's veiled threats, of Henry's stark warning. The simple, unshakable truth in Ava's words stood in stark defiance against a tide of greed that had swept away many stronger claims than hers. But looking down at her small, determined face, he felt his own resolve harden into something unbreakable. "No," he said, the word a vow. "We won't let them take it." They rode on through the deepening afternoon, the mule's hooves steady on the familiar, treacherous trail. Mateo felt Ava's absolute trust in the way she leaned against him, a silent weight of responsibility and purpose. His own thoughts turned to the preparations that lay ahead. The mountain winds carried the scent of snow, promising another storm. But it wasn't the weather that worried Mateo now. Henry's words echoed in his mind. Winter storms gather quickly. He had chosen solitude years ago to escape exactly these kinds of troubles. Now, watching Ava's small hand still clutching her peppermint stick, he realized that choice was no longer his to make. The threats would come, as certain as the winter snow. But this time, Mateo wouldn't face the storm alone. Back at the line shack, the last rays of sun filtered through the tall pines, casting long, dark shadows across the snow. Mateo watched Ava as she struggled with an armload of firewood. Her small arms trembled under the weight, but a fierce determination shone in her eyes as she carefully placed each log on the growing stack by the door. "That's right," Mateo said, his voice softer than usual as he demonstrated the proper technique. "Layer them like building blocks. See? Keeps them steady and dry." Ava nodded, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration as she positioned another piece of wood. "Like this. Just so." Mateo allowed himself a slight, rare smile. "You're a quick study." He had decided that keeping busy was the best way to ward off the worry that gnawed at both of them. After the wood was stacked high and neat, he led Ava to a small clearing near the shack. "Time you learned about snares," he said, pulling a length of thin, flexible wire from his coat pocket. "Might need fresh meat while I'm checking the far traps." Ava watched intently, her blue eyes wide with focus, as Mateo's weathered, calloused hands expertly shaped the wire into a loop. He explained each step with a patience he didn't know he possessed. How to find a game trail, where to set the delicate trigger, how to secure the anchor so the animal couldn't escape. "Remember," he cautioned, his voice serious, "you check them early each morning. We don't want any creature suffering longer than necessary." "Yes, sir," she said, her tone equally serious. Ava's fingers were clumsy at first as she practiced with her own piece of wire, but she didn't give up. The wire twisted and bent in the wrong ways, but she persisted, her small brow furrowed in concentration. By the fourth try, she had fashioned a serviceable, if not perfect, snare. "Well done," Mateo said, surprised by the swell of pride in his voice. He couldn't remember the last time he had taught anyone anything. The sky had deepened to a bruised purple when they finally headed back inside. Mateo stoked the stove while Ava set out their simple supper: beans, cornbread, and the last of the dried venison. The familiar, comforting scents filled the small space, making it feel more like a home than it had in 8 long years. They ate in a comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the scrape of their spoons against the tin plates and the soft pop and crackle of the burning pine knots in the stove. Mateo noticed Ava stealing glances at him between bites, as if she were working up the courage to say something. Finally, she set down her tin plate, her meal unfinished. "Mr. Mateo?" she began, then hesitated, biting her lower lip. She took a deep breath and pressed on. Did you, did you always live alone up here?" Mateo's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. The question, so innocent, so direct, stirred memories he'd long tried to bury beneath years of snow and silence. Sarah's laugh, a sound like wind chimes. Little Emma's first wobbly steps across this very floor. He set the spoon down slowly, the clatter loud in the quiet cabin. "No," he said at last, his voice raspy. "Not always." Ava waited, her gaze steady, patient as only children can be when they sense an important truth is about to be revealed. Mateo's voice grew rough, the words tearing their way out of him. Had me a wife once. Sarah was her name. And a daughter, Emma. He paused, the name a ghost on his lips. She was about your age. What happened to them? Ava's question was barely a whisper, a breath of air. Mateo stared into the stove's small grated window, seeing not the glowing embers but another fire, a raging inferno from long ago. Cabin caught fire one night. I was out checking my trap lines. A storm had come up. His voice broke. By the time I saw the smoke, by the time I got back, he swallowed hard, the memory choking him. There was nothing left, nothing but ashes. The silence that followed was heavy and profound, filled with a shared unspoken grief. Then Mateo felt a small, warm hand slip into his own. He looked down to find Ava's small fingers wrapped tightly around his calloused, scarred palm. You won't lose me too, she said, her voice filled with a quiet, fierce certainty. I promise. Something cracked deep inside Mateo's chest, a thick wall he had built around his heart, brick by painful brick, 8 years ago. The simple, impossible warmth of her promise both comforted and terrified him. He wanted to believe her, wanted it more than anything, yet he feared the unimaginable pain of losing another child. Before he could find the words to respond, Ava yawned widely, a huge jaw-cracking yawn that made her eyes water. The long day of work and worry had finally caught up with her. Best get some sleep, Mateo said gruffly, giving her hand a gentle squeeze before letting it go. There's more work to do tomorrow. As Ava curled up in her borrowed blankets on the bunk, Mateo added more wood to the stove and checked the action on his rifle one last time before settling into his chair by the window. The moon rose over the jagged ridge, casting a cold silver light on the fresh snow. He would stand watch tonight. Miles away, in a well-appointed office in Pine Creek, Deputy Marshal Darnell stood before a massive oak desk. The railroad boss, James Mitchell, leaned back in his plush leather chair, a thick cigar clamped between his teeth, a cloud of blue smoke obscuring his features. He listened intently to the deputy's report. You're certain it was Thomas Whittam's girl? Mitchell's voice was carefully controlled, a low, dangerous rumble, but his knuckles had whitened around his cigar. No doubt about it, Darnell confirmed. She's living with that hermit, Mateo Hale, up in his line shack. She must have the deed papers with her. Mitchell stood and walked to the window, staring out at the railroad yard where his massive steam engines waited like sleeping iron giants. That spring, he said more to himself than to Darnell, is the key to everything, a year-round water supply, the perfect position for a new depot. He turned back to Darnell, his eyes cold and hard as river stones. We can't let some broken-down mountain hermit and an orphan brat stand in the way of progress. What are your orders? Darnell asked, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol. Mitchell's smile was a chilling, predatory thing that didn't reach his eyes. Start with persuasion. Remind Hale that accidents happen in these mountains. If he proves stubborn, he shrugged, a casual, dismissive gesture. Fire has a way of destroying evidence. And that old shack of his, it's just asking to burn, isn't it? Darnell nodded, a slow, understanding smile spreading across his own face. He was already planning. I know some men who can handle it. Quiet like. We'll move tonight. Good, Mitchell said, returning to his desk, dismissing the deputy with a wave of his hand. See that it's done. He paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper. And Darnell? No witnesses. The deputy touched the brim of his hat and slipped out of the office. Within an hour, a group of shadowy riders began gathering in a sheltered valley just below Mateo's shack. They would wait for the full dark, then they would move in. Their horses stamped quietly in the snow as the men checked their weapons and passed a bottle of whiskey back and forth for warmth. Up at the line shack, Mateo and Ava rose with the dawn, blissfully unaware of the danger gathering in the valley below. She helped him haul water from the creek, her small face bright with purpose, while he showed her how to judge the thickness of the ice. The morning passed in a peaceful rhythm of shared work. Mateo watched Ava moving beside him, and he felt that small hand in his from the night before. That impossible promise. It had awakened something in him he'd thought long dead, a fierce, primal need to protect, to nurture. The very thing that made him most vulnerable was also the thing that could give him the strength to face whatever was coming. Ava's bright laughter echoed across the snow as she discovered a set of rabbit tracks near the woodpile. "Look, Mr. Mateo, maybe we'll have rabbit stew for supper tomorrow." Mateo smiled despite himself, a real, genuine smile. "Maybe so, little one. Maybe so." The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, and in the valley below, patient, dangerous men waited for darkness to fall. The winter sun hung low on the horizon, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of amber and rose. A fragile, deceptive peace settled over the high country. Mateo had just finished showing Ava how to clean the morning's catch, two plump rabbits from her new snares, when his body tensed, every nerve ending screaming. Years of living alone in the wilderness had sharpened his senses to a razor's edge, and now they screamed a single, silent word: danger. He heard it before he saw it, the unnatural crunch of snow, the soft jingle of a harness, horses moving carefully through the timber. "Inside," he whispered to Ava, his voice low and urgent. She looked up from her work, her eyes wide with fear. "Quick and quiet." They slipped into the shack, and Mateo immediately moved to extinguish the lantern, plunging the small cabin into near darkness. Darkness would be their ally tonight. He retrieved his old Winchester rifle from its pegs above the door, the worn wood familiar and comforting in his hands. He checked the action with a practiced, fluid motion. Ava pressed close to his side, her small, cold fingers gripping his coat. "Mr. Mateo?" Her voice was a tiny, quavering thing in the sudden gloom. "Shh," he soothed, placing a gentle, reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Stay behind me." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew clearer, more distinct. Mateo counted at least 6 riders by their different gaits. Far too many for a friendly visit. He positioned himself by the window, the rifle ready, using the shadows to conceal his position while keeping Ava tucked safely behind him. Voices low and rough carried through the crisp evening air. Boots crunched in the snow. A horse nickered nervously. "Hail!" A sharp voice cut through the gathering dusk. "We know you're in there." Mateo recognized Deputy Marshal Darnell's voice. His jaw tightened, a knot of cold fury forming in his stomach. "Come on out, Hale," Darnell continued, his tone falsely friendly. "We just want to talk about them papers the girls got. Make this easy on yourself." Mateo felt Ava trembling against his leg. He squeezed her shoulder reassuringly before calling out, his own voice steady and hard. "Nothing to talk about, Darnell. This is private property. Don't be a fool about this, Hale. That spring claim ain't worth dying over." "Ain't planning on dying," Mateo's voice was steel, "nor on giving up what's rightfully hers." A different voice spoke up then, harder and colder than Darnell's. "Last chance, mountain man. Send out them papers or we're coming in to get them." Mateo's response was immediate and decisive. He raised the Winchester and fired a single deafening shot into the air. The report cracked across the valley like a clap of thunder, echoing off the silent peaks. Chaos erupted outside. Horses reared and whinnied. Men cursed and scrambled for cover. Mateo heard boots slipping in the snow and the metallic, menacing sound of multiple weapons being drawn. "That's your only warning," Mateo shouted into the darkness. "The next one won't be aimed so high." For several long, tense moments, the only sound was the mournful whisper of the wind through the pines. Then Darnell's voice returned, tight with a barely controlled rage. "This ain't over, Hale. You hear me? We'll be back. And next time, we won't be so neighborly about it." The sound of hoofbeats retreated into the timber, fading into the vast silence of the mountains. But Mateo kept his vigil at the window, his rifle held tight. He knew better than to trust an easy withdrawal. "Are they gone?" Ava whispered after a long silence had stretched between them. "For now," Mateo answered honestly, his eyes still scanning the dark tree line. "But they'll be back." They kept watch through the long, cold night. Mateo moved between the 2 small windows, a silent, grim sentinel, his rifle never leaving his hands. Ava huddled near the stove, wrapped in every blanket he owned. Neither of them slept. The hours stretched out, eternal and tense, marked only by the haunting chorus of wolves in the far distance and the occasional imagined sound of horses moving through the valley below. Ava's quiet voice broke one of the long silences, startling him. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mateo. I didn't mean to bring you all this trouble." Mateo turned from the window to look at her. The moonlight filtering through the grimy glass caught the glint of tears on her cheeks. His heart twisted. "Now you listen here," he said, crouching down to meet her eyes, his voice fierce but not unkind. "This ain't your fault. Those men out there, they're the ones bringing the trouble, and I will not let them take what's yours. You understand me?" She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her sleeve. "Promise?" "Promise." The word came easier than he expected, and he realized with a shock that he meant it with every fiber of his being. Dawn was just beginning to pale the eastern sky when they heard it, a soft whistle from the trees, 3 notes rising and falling like a thrush's morning song. Mateo's tension eased slightly. He knew that signal. "Henry," he said quietly, moving to unbar the door. The Apache scout materialized from the shadows like a ghost, his moccasins leaving barely a trace in the fresh snow. His dark eyes took in Mateo's rifle, Ava's worried face, and the tense set of the cabin. "They will come again tonight," Henry said without preamble, his voice a low murmur. "More men, more guns." He gestured down toward the valley. "I watched them gather in town. The railroad boss, he offers good money to any man willing to burn you out." Mateo's grip tightened on his rifle stock. "Let them try." Henry shook his head, a slow, deliberate movement. "Too many. You should take the girl. Go north while you still can. The mountains are deep." "No." Mateo's response was immediate, absolute. "Running won't solve this. They'll just keep coming. They'll just keep taking what isn't theirs." He looked at Ava, at her small, determined face, and he remembered her father's crumbling cabin and the spring that had sustained generations. "This is her land," he said, his voice raw with a conviction that surprised him. "Her birthright. We stand here." Henry studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes searching Mateo's face. Then he nodded slowly. "Then you will need better shelter than this." He gestured at the line shack's thin, vulnerable walls. "The old cabin, it has a stone foundation, thick walls. It could be made strong again." Mateo considered this. The abandoned cabin was closer to the spring, with better sight lines and the natural protection of the ridge behind it. If they could just repair it enough. "My papa's cabin," Ava's voice was suddenly bright with a desperate, fragile hope. "Could we really?" Mateo looked down at her eager, upturned face, then back at Henry. "It would take work, a lot of work, and we don't have much time." "Then we should begin," Henry said simply. "I will help." The sun was just cresting the ridge when they set out, leaving the relative safety of the shack behind. Mateo loaded his mule with every tool, scrap of food, and blanket he possessed, while Henry ranged ahead, a silent scout checking their path. Ava walked between them, clutching her father's Bible and the precious papers close to her chest. As they approached the old cabin, the dawn's light revealed both its deep wounds and its hidden potential. The collapsed section of the roof could be rebuilt. The stone walls, though weathered, still stood strong. The hearth that had once warmed Ava's family could do so again. Mateo watched as Ava reached out and touched the cabin's weathered logs, her small hand gentle against the wood that had sheltered her earliest memories. Despite the very real danger waiting in the valley below, her face shone with something he hadn't seen there before. Pure, undiluted hope. "Well," Mateo said, setting down his heavy load of tools, the sound echoing in the quiet clearing. "Best get started." He looked at Henry, who nodded in grim agreement. Together, the two men began the monumental task of turning the broken, abandoned cabin into a fortress. Ava moved among them, a small, tireless worker, carrying smaller pieces of wood and fetching tools as they were needed. Her presence was a constant, silent reminder of exactly what they were fighting for. It was more than just a piece of land or a legal water claim. They were defending a child's future, her rightful inheritance, and perhaps something even more precious. The chance to make things right in a world that so often and so easily forgot its promises. The morning sun climbed higher as they worked, casting long shadows across the snow-covered valley. And miles below, In the smoky warmth of the town saloon, their enemies were surely planning for the night to come. The winter sun hung high and pale overhead as Mateo led his loaded mule along the snowy path toward the abandoned cabin. Ava walked beside him, her small boots leaving delicate, determined prints in the fresh powder. Henry moved ahead of them like a shadow, his eyes constantly scanning, checking their trail and the high ridge for any signs of trouble. The old cabin emerged from the trees, its broken shape a stark, dark silhouette against the white landscape. Snow had drifted through the partially collapsed roof, forming small, white banks on the floor inside. An icy wind whistled a mournful tune through the gaps in the log walls, but the foundation stones, set deep in the mountain soil by Thomas Whittam's own hands, still stood firm. Mateo tied the mule in a sheltered spot and began unloading their precious supplies. "First thing," he said, handing Ava a small wooden shovel he'd made for her. "We need to clear out that snow. Think you can manage that?" She nodded eagerly, already moving toward the cabin's dark entrance. "Papa taught me how to shovel last winter," she said, her voice filled with a fierce, sad pride. "Before he got sick." Henry returned from his scout of the perimeter, his well-worn axe resting on his shoulder. "No fresh track," he reported, "but we should work quick. The days are short now." They fell into a natural, unspoken rhythm of labor. While Ava diligently cleared the snow from the cabin's interior, Mateo and Henry assessed the damage. The roof needed the most attention. Several of the main support beams had rotted through, causing the collapse. But the main wall timbers, protected by the deep eaves from years of weather, were still solid. "Good bones," Henry commented, running a hand along one of the massive logs. "Like an old horse. Looks rough, but it is still strong inside." Mateo grunted in agreement as he pulled his heavy cross-cut saw from the mule's pack. "Reckon we can shore up these walls first, then tackle the roof." He glanced up at the pale sky. "We've got maybe 6 hours of daylight left." They started with the walls, wedging freshly cut poles between the standing timbers to brace them against the wind and the weight of the coming repairs. Henry's axe rang out, a sharp, clean sound in the silent woods, as he expertly shaped the support pieces. Mateo's saw rasped with a steady rhythmic cadence through the fallen logs. The familiar sounds of honest, hard work filled the clearing. Ava finished her shoveling and immediately looked for more ways to help. She gathered smaller flat stones from the frozen creek bed, carrying them two at a time to where Mateo was beginning to rebuild the crumbling chimney. Her face grew red with the effort, her breath coming in small white puffs, but she never complained. "Much obliged, little lady," Mateo said as she delivered another pair of rocks. "You're working harder than both of us old men put together." She beamed at the praise, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her whole face. She started humming as she went back for more stones, the tune and old hymn Mateo recognized from his own distant childhood. Amazing Grace. Something about her simple, unwavering faith, expressed in song while she labored against such impossible odds, touched a place in his heart he'd thought was long frozen over. By mid-afternoon, they had the walls secured and had begun the difficult work of rebuilding the roof. Henry, it turned out, was a master at notching logs to fit tightly together, while Mateo's experience with building his own cabin helped them work with a surprising efficiency. Even Jed the mule contributed. His strong back used to drag the larger timbers into position when needed. Ava kept their spirits up through the long, grueling hours. She told them stories about helping her father repair fences. She asked endless, intelligent questions about Henry's tracking skills, and she shared her own innocent dreams for the cabin's future. "We could plant flowers come spring," she said hopefully, her eyes shining, "right by the door. And maybe we could keep chickens, like Mama used to." Mateo found himself smiling more than he had in 8 years. The girl's fierce optimism was infectious, warming him better than any fire could. He watched her carefully stacking kindling near the hearth, her movements precise and purposeful. She had her father's determination, he reckoned, and something more, a spirit that refused to be broken. As evening approached and the shadows grew long, Henry disappeared briefly into the woods. He returned carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle that proved to be fresh venison, already cut and ready for stewing. "Took this buck 2 days ago," he explained. Thought we might need good meat for our work. Mateo got a fire going in the newly rebuilt hearth, while Ava helped Henry prepare the stew. They added dried beans and the last of Mateo's potatoes, letting it simmer over the flames while they finished the last of the day's work. The rich, savory smell of cooking food filled the small cabin, making it feel more like a home with each passing hour. Night settled over the mountains as they finally sat down to eat. The stew was rich and hearty, warming them from the inside out. Henry had even brought fresh bread, and they used it to sop up every last drop from their tin plates. In the flickering firelight, Henry's dark eyes grew distant as he spoke of Ava's father. "He was a good man," he said softly. "I remember when he first found the spring. He came to our camp. He spoke with the elders. He said the water should be for everyone, white man and Apache both." Ava sat up straighter, her face glowing with pride in the warm light. "Papa always said the spring was a gift from God," she declared firmly, "and gifts are meant for sharing." Mateo watched her face as she spoke of her father's dream. There was something so pure, so unshakable in her conviction, that it made his own cynicism seem shabby and small by comparison. Without thinking, he reached for her father's Bible, where it lay on the hearth beside her. "Would you like me to read some?" he asked, surprising himself as much as he surprised her. Ava nodded eagerly, scooting closer to the fire's warmth. Even Henry leaned forward slightly, his usual stoic expression softening in the firelight. Mateo opened the worn book carefully, its pages already feeling familiar from their evening readings in his shack. He found the book of Psalms and began to read, his voice stronger now, more confident. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." The ancient, powerful words filled the small, rebuilt cabin, mixing with the soft crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. Ava closed her eyes, her lips moving silently as she mouthed the verses she knew by heart. Henry sat perfectly still, his face thoughtful as he listened. What none of them saw, what none of them could know, was the dark figure crouching in the shadows beyond the cabin's new walls. It was one of Deputy Darnell's hired men, sent to watch their movements. He noted the strengthened walls, the rebuilt roof, the easy, determined way the three worked together. And most importantly, he saw how the cabin was becoming more than just a shelter. It was becoming a symbol of defiance, a fortress of hope against the railroad's plans. The spy waited until Mateo finished reading, until the fire had died down to glowing embers, and the three inside had prepared for sleep. Then he slipped away through the darkness, a silent shadow heading down the mountain to report what he had seen. By sunrise, Darnell and Mitchell would know that taking this cabin would not be as simple as they had hoped. Inside, unaware of their observer, Mateo helped Ava make a bed near the hearth, using the blankets from his shack. Henry chose to sleep near the door, his rifle close at hand. As Mateo settled into his own blankets, he heard Ava's quiet voice from the darkness. "Mr. Mateo?" "Yes." "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for helping me make Papa's cabin strong again." He swallowed past a sudden tightness in his throat. "You're welcome, little one. Now get some sleep. We have more work to do tomorrow." The fire's glow painted soft, dancing shadows on the cabin's new walls. Walls that now stood straight and true, rebuilt by their shared labor. Mateo listened to Ava's breathing grow steady and deep with sleep, while Henry kept his silent, vigilant watch by the door. Outside, a light snow began to fall again, but inside the cabin was warm with more than just firelight, and Mateo realized as sleep finally took him that he had found something he'd thought was forever lost. A family, different from his first, formed not by blood, but by choice and by circumstance. But no less real for that. Tomorrow would bring its own dangers. But tonight, in this restored cabin, they were home. Dawn broke cold and clear over the mountain valley. Mateo saddled his mule early, his breath frosting in the frigid air as he checked the cinch twice before mounting. He had spent half the night worrying about leaving Ava, even with Henry's protection, but they needed more supplies to fortify the cabin properly. Nails, hinges, and more ammunition. "I'll be back before sundown," Mateo promised, looking down at Ava from the saddle. She stood beside Henry in the cabin doorway, wrapped in one of Mateo's old blankets against the morning chill. "We will be fine," Henry assured him, his hand resting protectively on Ava's shoulder. The child and I have much to learn from each other today. Ava nodded eagerly, her face bright. Henry's going to show me how to catch rabbits with a throwing stick. Her excitement made Mateo smile despite his deep-seated concerns. Mind what Henry tells you, Mateo said, his voice firm, and stay close to the cabin. He turned the mule down the trail, glancing back just once to see Ava waving, a small, brave figure in the vast white wilderness. The sight of her there, safe with Henry, eased some of his worry. Still, he kept one hand near his rifle as he rode, his eyes constantly scanning the silent timber. The town of Pine Creek lay quiet when Mateo arrived, though he felt eyes watching him from behind curtained windows. He tied his mule outside the general store, noting how the low hum of conversation inside died the moment he entered. Mrs. Peterson, the owner's wife, gave him a small, sympathetic look as she gathered his order of flour and coffee. Folks have been talking, she said softly, her voice barely a whisper, glancing around to ensure no one else was near. Some are saying it ain't right, what the railroad's trying to do to that child's claim. Mateo nodded, keeping his own voice equally low. I appreciate knowing that, ma'am. My Thomas, he says he remembers the day her father filed those water rights. Proper and legal, he said. She wrapped the flour carefully in brown paper. The railroad can't just take what ain't theirs, no matter how much money they wave around. From the street came the heavy sound of boots on the wooden planks of the boardwalk. Deputy Darnell passed by the store window, his shadow falling across the counter between them like a bad omen. Mrs. Peterson quickly busied herself with measuring coffee beans, her friendly demeanor vanishing. Mateo felt the tension in the room rise as several of Darnell's cronies gathered outside, their voices deliberately loud, carrying easily through the thin walls. Ought to run that mountain man out of the territory, one of them said. Him and that Apache both. Hanging's too good for claim jumpers, another added, loud enough to ensure Mateo heard every word. Mateo finished his purchase without responding to the threats, though his jaw tightened until it ached. He needed more supplies, but he decided he would wait until the hostile crowd dispersed before visiting the other shops. At the blacksmith's, old Jake Wilson was more direct. The deputy's been gathering men, he warned in a low voice while wrapping Mateo's purchase of nails. He's talking about riding up there in force, maybe 3 days from now. He hesitated, then added, his eyes meeting Mateo's. Some of us. We remember how things used to be before the railroad started squeezing folks dry. That spring water ought to be for everybody, just like the girl's father wanted. Much obliged for the warning, Jake, Mateo said quietly. He added a box of ammunition to his purchases, noting how the old blacksmith slipped 2 extra boxes under the counter wrap without charging him for them. The hardware store proved more hostile. The owner, a man known to be deep in debt to the railroad, refused to sell to him entirely, turning his back without a word. But at the feed store, the widow Carson not only filled his order for grain for the mule, but added an extra sack. For that poor child, she said, her expression a mixture of pity and defiance. All morning, Mateo felt Deputy Darnell's eyes following him. The man lounged outside the saloon, making no overt move to interfere, but radiating a palpable menace. Their gazes met once across the dusty, frozen street. The deputy's hand drifted down to rest on the butt of his gun, a silent, unmistakable promise of the violence to come. Back at the cabin, Ava was having a far different and far better experience. Henry proved to be a patient, gifted teacher. He showed her how to set more effective snares using supple willow branches and twine he'd made himself. His strong, steady hands guided her smaller ones as she learned to tie the proper, intricate knots. Like this, she asked, proudly holding up her finished snare for his inspection. Henry examined it carefully from every angle. Good, he said, a rare smile touching his lips. You learn quick, like your father did. You knew my papa well. He respected the old ways, Henry said, as he carefully set her new snare beside a rabbit trail. He understood that the land and the water belonged to no one man alone. They spent the morning checking Henry's trap line, with Ava asking an endless stream of questions about tracking and woodcraft. He showed her how to read the subtle animal signs in the snow, how to move quietly through the thick brush, how to spot the best places for snares. After catching 2 fat rabbits, they returned to the cabin. Henry taught her to clean the game, his movements precise and filled with a deep, quiet respect for the animal. "We thank the animal for its gift," he explained to her, "and we waste nothing." While the rabbit stewed over the fire, Henry showed her how to fletch arrows, explaining how different types of feathers affected their flight. Ava proved to have a steady hand and a keen eye for the delicate work. "Uncle Henry," she said suddenly, testing the new name on her tongue, "would you teach me how to shoot a bow someday?" Henry's normally stoic expression softened at the unexpected title. He placed a gentle hand on her head. "When you are ready, little one, when you are ready." The sun was beginning to set, painting the snow in shades of orange and pink, when they heard the sound of Mateo's mule on the trail. Ava ran to meet him, helping him unload the supplies while chattering excitedly about her day with Henry. Mateo noticed a new confidence in the way she moved through the woods, and he saw the quiet pride in Henry's eyes as the Apache watched her. Inside the warm, fragrant cabin, they shared the rabbit stew while Mateo reported on the town's tense, divided mood. He kept the worst of the direct threats to himself, but he made it clear that serious trouble was coming. "We'll need to be extra careful now," he said, his voice grim. "No fires at night, no moving far from the cabin." Ava listened solemnly, her small face serious. Then she asked a question that stunned him. "Can we pray for them? For the town's people?" Mateo and Henry exchanged glances, surprised by her request. "Even for the deputy?" Mateo asked, incredulous. "Especially for him," Ava said firmly. "Papa always said that prayer changes hearts." Before Mateo could respond, she folded her small hands and began to pray. "Dear Lord, please help the people in town remember that your gifts are for everyone. Help them be brave enough to stand up for what's right. And please keep us safe, especially Mr. Mateo and Uncle Henry. Amen." Mateo felt something shift deep inside him at her simple, powerful words. Here was this child who had lost everything, praying not for herself but for others, even for those who meant her harm. His own reluctance to believe, his years of bitter, corrosive doubt, seemed shabby and weak compared to her pure, unshakable faith. Henry's voice broke the silence that followed. "Your father would be very proud of you, little one." Mateo could only nod, his throat too tight for words. He busied himself checking the cabin's new defenses, while Ava helped Henry clean up from supper. Her quiet humming of hymns filled the cabin, a gentle counterpoint to the wind's mournful moan outside. Later that night, as Ava slept soundly near the banked fire, Mateo stood watch by the window. Henry's voice came soft beside him in the darkness. "The child changes things," the Apache said. "She makes men remember who they could be." Mateo thought of the divided town, of the few brave people who had helped him today despite their fear. "Maybe she shames us into being better than we are. Or reminds us of what we once were," Henry replied, "before fear and greed hardened our hearts." Mateo watched Ava's peaceful sleep, her prayer still echoing in his mind. Perhaps faith wasn't about having all the answers, he reflected. Perhaps it was about choosing to believe in something bigger than oneself, something worth fighting for. Outside, the snow began to fall again, a soft, white blanket coating the valley. Mateo knew that trouble was coming, as surely as the sunrise. But for now, in this moment, they were safe. The cabin stood strong around them, and Ava's quiet, steady breathing spoke of a trust and a hope that he would die to protect. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it together. The Sunday morning sun painted the snow-covered valley in brilliant, dazzling diamonds, but its beauty brought no warmth. Mateo's breath frosted in the bitter air as he saddled his mule. Beside him, Henry prepared his own mount, while Ava bounced eagerly near the cabin door, already dressed in her best, a freshly cleaned dress Mrs. Peterson had given her. "Papa always said the Sabbath was the Lord's day," Ava declared, her voice filled with a solemn joy as she pulled on her worn wool coat. "No matter what." Mateo adjusted the mule's bridle, fighting down the deep unease that coiled in his gut. "It might be safer to hold our own service here, Ava." "The Lord will protect us," she said with a complete, unshakable conviction that made Mateo's own doubts feel small and cowardly. Henry spoke quietly as he helped Ava mount behind Mateo. His words meant only for him. "Sometimes, my friend, courage is found in simple things. breaking bread together, sharing God's word. The ride into town took longer than usual. They kept to the main trail, a deliberate choice, not wanting to appear furtive or afraid. The church bell was already ringing as they approached, its clear, hopeful tones carrying across the frozen landscape. Mateo noticed how Ava sat up straighter at the sound, her small hands tightening on his coat. The little white church stood at the edge of town, its steeple reaching toward the crystal blue sky like a prayer. Several townspeople were already filing in as Mateo helped Ava down from the mule. He caught worried glances, heard whispered conversations stop abruptly as they approached. Henry dismounted silently, his tall, imposing presence drawing even more stares. At the church steps, Mateo hesitated. It had been more than 8 years since he had willingly entered a house of worship, but Ava took his hand firmly in hers, tugging him forward with the same quiet determination she'd shown that first day in the snow. The interior of the church was warm, the air still and reverent, lit by the morning sun filtering through frosted windows. The wooden pews creaked as heads turned to watch them enter. Mateo saw Deputy Darnell in the back row, his face darkening with a look of pure venom. But he also saw others who nodded cautiously. The Petersons, the widow Carson, old Jake Wilson from the smithy. They took seats near the middle of the church, Ava a small, calm presence between Mateo and Henry. The girl seemed oblivious to the palpable tension in the room, her eyes fixed on the simple wooden cross above the altar. Soon, Preacher Matthews stepped up to the pulpit, his weathered, kind face surveying his congregation. His gaze lingered for a moment on their unusual trio before he opened his Bible. Today's reading, he announced in his deep, resonant voice, comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 4. He paused, letting the silence settle. But whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. Mateo felt Ava straighten beside him at the words. The preacher's eyes seemed to meet hers as he spoke of the woman at the well, of living water freely given to all who thirst. His sermon masterfully wove together the themes of physical thirst and spiritual hunger, the fundamental human need for both earthly and heavenly sustenance. Throughout his sermon, his gaze kept returning to Ava. When he finished, the congregation sat in a deep, thoughtful silence. Then Ava stood up. The sudden movement was so unexpected that a collective gasp went through the church. Her small figure, standing alone in the aisle, drew every eye. "Excuse me, Preacher Matthews," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying easily in the quiet church. "My papa always said the same thing about our spring." Mateo started to reach for her, to pull her back down, but Henry's firm hand on his arm stopped him. "You see," Ava continued, her voice ringing with the simple power of truth, "Papa found that spring up on the ridge, and he marked it proper. But he didn't mark it just for us. He said clean water was God's gift to everyone, not something to be sold or hoarded." She looked around the church, her gaze moving from face to face, meeting the surprised eyes of her neighbors without a trace of fear. "That's why he filed the claim, so everyone could use it, not just those with enough money to buy it." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Mateo saw some people nodding in agreement, others frowning, their faces troubled. Deputy Darnell's face had gone a blotchy, furious red, but Preacher Matthews was smiling. "Out of the mouths of babe," he said softly. Then, his voice booming through the church, he said, "The child speaks the truth. Water, like God's grace, was meant to be shared by all." He stepped down from the pulpit, his black robes sweeping behind him, and approached their pew. "Miss Ava," he said, his voice gentle again, "would you and your guardians permit me to hold next Sunday's service at your cabin? To dedicate it anew as a place of worship and fellowship for this entire community?" The deputy stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly on the wooden floor. "Now see here, preacher, you can't." "It would be our honor," Ava interrupted brightly, her voice drowning out his angry protest. "Papa would have loved that." More whispers, more excited murmurs filled the church. Mateo saw fear on some faces, but he also saw something else. A spark of defiance, a flicker of hope. The preacher's bold declaration had drawn a line in the sand, forcing people to choose a side. "Then it is settled," Preacher Matthews announced, his voice ringing with authority. Next Sunday, we worship at the Witam cabin. All are welcome. His emphasis on the last two words was deliberate and unmistakable. The rest of the service passed in a blur of hymns and prayers. Mateo found himself singing along, the words of the old songs returning to him after years of silence. Beside him, Ava's clear, sweet voice rose true and strong. Even Henry hummed quietly, honoring their shared faith in his own way. Afterward, as they prepared to leave, several townspeople approached them. Mrs. Peterson pressed a basket filled with fresh bread and preserves into Ava's hands. Jake Wilson promised to ride up during the week with tools to help further repair the cabin. The widow Carson hugged Ava tightly, whispering words of encouragement, but others hurried past, refusing to meet their eyes. The deputy and his friends gathered in angry knots near the door, their voices low and menacing. Mateo kept Ava close as they made their way to their mounts. "That was quite a speech, little one," Henry said as they rode out of town, his voice laced with admiration. Ava smiled. "I just said what Papa would have wanted me to say." Mateo studied her proud profile against the winter sky. "Your father would be mighty pleased with you, I reckon." He glanced back at the town, now growing distant behind them. "Though you've stirred up quite a hornet's nest back there." "Truth often does," Henry observed quietly. They rode on in a companionable silence, the cold air nipping at their faces. Mateo found his thoughts turning to the coming Sunday, to all the preparations that would be needed to host the service. The cabin would need more work, benches to build, space to clear. Yet beneath his practical concerns ran a deeper current of wonder and awe at the small girl riding behind him. Back at the cabin, they shared Mrs. Peterson's bread and preserves for lunch. Ava chattered excitedly about her plans for the service, where people would sit, what hymns they should sing, how they could decorate the cabin with pine boughs. "We'll need to fix that north wall proper," Mateo mused aloud, eyeing their rough repairs, "and maybe build some kind of shelter for folks' horses." "I will bring more stones for the chimney," Henry added. "Make it strong before next Sunday." Ava beamed at them both, her face alight with joy. "See? God is helping us already. He's sending us friends." Mateo wanted to caution her that their enemies were gathering too, that the deputy and the railroad men would not take this public challenge lightly. But looking at her shining, hopeful face, he couldn't bring himself to dim her joy. Instead, he found himself sharing her hope, despite his own deep-seated fears. That evening, as the shadows lengthened across the snow, they gathered around the fire to plan. Henry sketched ideas in the ashes for improving the cabin's defenses, while still making it welcoming. Mateo made a list of needed supplies and repairs. Ava, with painstaking care, copied out her favorite hymns from her father's Bible in her neat, careful handwriting. "Will you read us something, Mr. Mateo?" she asked, holding out the Bible to him. "Something about courage." Mateo took the worn book, finding a surprising comfort in its familiar weight. As he began to read the story of David facing Goliath, he saw it with new eyes. Sometimes the smallest champions, armed with nothing but faith and truth, could change the course of everything. Outside, the winter wind sang a lonely song through the pine boughs. Inside, the lamplight gleamed on Ava's bright, attentive face, on Henry's thoughtful profile, on the rough, strong walls that sheltered them. And Mateo felt the presence of God more strongly than he had in 8 long years, as if the cabin itself had become sacred space. None of them could know what dark plots were being laid in town, what violent plans were taking shape in secret meetings. For now they had this moment, warm, safe, and united in a shared purpose. The rest would come as it would, guided perhaps by a hand far greater than their own. The week unfolded like a well-worn hymn, each day bringing new life and purpose to the restored cabin. Dawn found Mateo and Henry already at work, their breath frosting in the crisp morning air as they hauled logs and measured boards. The steady, rhythmic sound of axe and saw filled the clearing, punctuated by the sharp tap of hammer on nail. "Reckon this roof will hold through anything now," Mateo said, wiping sweat from his brow despite the winter chill. They had reinforced the beams with fresh timber and laid new shingles in neat, overlapping rows. Henry nodded, running his hand along a freshly squared beam. "It is strong enough for many winters to come." His dark eyes swept the clearing. "There is good medicine here now." This place wants to live again. Below them, Ava darted between the wood piles, gathering kindling in her apron. Her clear voice carried up to them as she sang snatches of hymns, practicing for Sunday. Mateo found himself humming along, surprised and a little unsettled to find he remembered the words after so many silent years. They dug the root cellar deep, shoring up its walls with stone and timber. Henry showed them how to weave pine boughs into a temporary shelter for the horses, the way his people had done for generations. Mateo, using his considerable strength, built rough benches from split logs, enough to seat 30 people. Inside the cabin, Ava threw herself into learning the household tasks she barely remembered from her early childhood. The widow Carson had loaned them a butter churn, and the girl worked it faithfully each morning, her small arms pumping the handle with a tireless rhythm. "Look, Mr. Mateo," she called one afternoon, proudly holding up her first small pat of pale yellow butter. "Mrs. Peterson showed me how yesterday. Now we can have proper biscuits for the service." Mateo reached out and gently touched her head. "Your mama would be proud, seeing you keep a house so fine." Her smile wavered only slightly at the mention of her mother. "I remember how she used to do things," she said softly. "Sometimes I pretend she's watching me, showing me how still." Throughout the week, word of the upcoming service spread through the town like wildfire. Riders passed on the main trail below the cabin. Some waved, others averted their eyes. The general store owner sent up a pack mule loaded with supplies, coffee, sugar, flour, carried by his oldest son, who whispered that half the town was planning to come. "The deputy is mad as a wet hen," the boy reported, his eyes wide. "The railroad boss, too. They've been having meetings at the saloon, but a lot of folks aren't listening to them anymore." By Saturday evening, the first wagons began to appear, their wheels creaking up the snowy track. The Peterson family arrived with quilts and extra chairs. The blacksmith, Jake Wilson, brought his wife and daughters, their arms laden with baskets of food. The widow Carson came with her two grown sons, who immediately began setting up more benches in the yard. As dusk settled over the valley, more families gathered. Lanterns bobbed through the trees like earthbound stars as people found their way up the winding trail. The excited whispers of children carried on the cold evening air. Women arranged food on long plank tables, while men gathered in small groups, their voices low and serious. Mateo watched from the cabin door, amazed at how the lonely clearing had been transformed into a bustling, hopeful community. Henry appeared at his shoulder, silent as always. "I never thought to see such a gathering up here," Mateo murmured, his voice filled with awe. "The people choose truth when they are given the chance," Henry replied. "Like water, it always finds its path." Ava flitted between the groups, a small, glowing beacon of welcome. She seemed to know everyone's names, asking after their families, showing the other children where they could play safely. Mateo marveled at her natural grace, a warmth and an openness so like her father's. They spent the night in the cabin, while most of the families returned to town, promising to come back at dawn. Mateo barely slept, watching the moonlight pattern the new-laid floor. In the other bunk, Ava's breathing came soft and steady, peaceful in her unwavering faith. Sunday morning broke clear and cold, the sun casting long, sharp shadows across the fresh snow. People began arriving early, dressed in their Sunday best, their faces filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. By 9 o'clock, nearly 40 souls had gathered in the clearing. Preacher Matthews arrived last, his old buggy creaking up the final stretch of the trail. He carried his Bible and wore his formal black coat, his manner grave but determined. Mateo met him at the newly built cabin steps. "That's quite a congregation you've drawn, preacher," Mateo said, surveying the crowd. "It's the girl's doing," the preacher replied, his eyes on Ava. "She has a way of making folks believe." He smiled. "The Lord works through the smallest vessels sometimes." He squared his shoulders. "Well, shall we begin?" They arranged everyone in a rough semicircle facing the cabin's open door. Some sat on the new benches, others stood, a few perched on wagon seats. The cold morning air rang with quiet greetings and murmured prayers. Preacher Matthews raised his hands for silence. Opening his Bible, he began to read, his voice carrying clear and strong in the winter stillness. "Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it." Mateo stood behind Ava, one hand resting on her shoulder, as the familiar, powerful words washed over them. Henry remained slightly apart, a silent, respectful observer. The preacher spoke of community, of sharing God's gifts, of the courage it takes to stand together against greed and fear. He blessed the cabin, the spring, the land itself. When he called Ava forward and prayed over her, many eyes in the crowd grew wet with tears. This child, he declared, his voice ringing with passion, has reminded us of truths we had all but forgotten. That water like grace flows for all. That faith like love only grows stronger when it is shared. They sang then, their voices rising pure and strong into the cold morning air. Amazing grace swelled from the gathering, followed by Rock of Ages, and then, shall we gather at the river? Matteo found himself singing full-throated, the words coming unbidden, surprising himself with the raw joy of it. For that one shining hour, hope bloomed in the cold mountain air like a fragile winter rose. Matteo saw it in the clasped hands of neighbors, in the faces of children playing freely, in the way people lingered to talk who had been strangers just a week before. This, he realized, this was what Ava's father had dreamed of. Not just water rights, but right relations between neighbors. A community bound by faith and mutual respect. Yet even in this moment of grace, darkness lurked at the edges. Matteo noticed the railroad man too late, a narrow-faced stranger slouching at the edge of the crowd, his cold, flat eyes taking in every detail. When their gazes met, the man turned and slipped away into the trees. Matteo started to follow, but then stopped himself. This was a day for fellowship, not for fear. The day stretched on, long and sweet. The women spread a feast on the plank tables, fried chicken, cornbread, preserved peaches. The men discussed the coming spring planting and shared tools. Children played tag between the trees until their mothers called them in for dinner. As the afternoon drew down, the wagons began leaving, one by one. People hugged Ava, thanked Matteo and Henry, and promised to return the next Sunday. Soon the clearing stood empty again, though somehow it felt fuller than before. That evening, they sat quiet around the fire, tired but content. Ava dozed in her chair, her small hands still clutching her father's Bible. Henry carved a small wooden horse, his hands moving with a sure and steady grace. Matteo stared into the flames, feeling the weight and the wonder of the day settle deep in his heart. Without planning to, he found himself speaking. "Lord," he said roughly, the words strange and unfamiliar on his tongue after so many silent, angry years. "Thank you for this day, for this child, for, for hope reborn." He paused, struggling for the words. "Help us be worthy of such grace." "Amen," Ava murmured sleepily from her chair. Henry's knife stilled. "Amen," he echoed softly. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines. Inside, the firelight danced on the walls of their sanctuary, warm with the day's blessings. And Matteo felt a peace settle over him like a familiar blanket, grateful for this one perfect moment of pure belonging. The wind picked up as night descended, whistling through the pine boughs and rattling the cabin's new shutters. A storm was coming. Inside, Matteo stoked the fire one last time before bed, while Ava sat cross-legged on her bunk, reading her father's Bible by lamplight. Henry had left earlier to check his trap line, promising to return by morning. "Time for sleep, little one," Matteo said, watching how the firelight caught in her dark hair, a sight so familiar, so painful, so like his lost daughter's. Ava nodded carefully, marking her place in the book with a piece of yarn. "Mr. Matteo," she asked, her voice small and serious, "do you think Mom and Papa can see us from heaven? Do you think they can see how we fixed their cabin?" The question caught in Matteo's throat, a knot of grief and love. Before he could find an answer, a sharp, violent crack split the night. Not thunder. Something else. Something wrong. Matteo's spine stiffened. Years of mountain living had taught him to read sounds like a book, and that sound wasn't natural. A flicker of orange light suddenly danced across the far wall, a malevolent, hungry light coming from outside. Matteo's heart stopped cold. He knew that light. He knew its hungry, devouring glow. Fire. "Ava, get down!" he shouted, his voice a raw command, just as a sheet of flames licked up the outer wall right beside the window. The dry wood of the new repairs, despite its freshness, caught instantly. Mateo grabbed his rifle and the heavy water bucket from the hearth. "Stay inside," he ordered Ava, who stood frozen in the center of the room, her face a mask of horror, clutching her Bible to her chest. He burst through the door into a chaotic scene of swirling snow and roaring fire. He threw the bucket of water at the flames, but it was like spitting on a furnace. The wind whipped the embers into his face, stinging his eyes. Gunshots cracked through the darkness, the bullets thudding into the log walls around him. Henry's voice suddenly rang out from the trees, his rifle returning fire at the shadowy figures that ducked and weaved between the trunks. The Apache's presence was an unexpected, desperate salvation. He must have sensed the trouble and doubled back. Inside, Ava screamed. Smoke had begun pouring through the seams in the new roof, where pitch-soaked torches had been thrown. Mateo's heart thundered in his chest as he desperately packed snow against the burning wall, his hands raw from the heat and cold. But for every flame he doused, two more seemed to spring up in its place. "Mateo!" Henry's shout carried over the roar of the fire and the crack of gunfire. "More of them! Coming from the south!" The roof was fully ablaze now, the decades-old timber crackling and groaning like a dying beast. Thick black smoke poured from every seam. Mateo's lungs burned as he raced back inside. Ava was huddled in a corner, coughing violently, her small body shaking. "We have to go. Now!" He scooped her up, her small body trembling uncontrollably against his chest. The Bible tumbled from her grip, landing with a soft thud on the floor as he carried her out into the blinding snow. Behind them, the main support beams of the roof groaned, then shattered. "The papers!" Ava cried, her voice choked with smoke and tears, struggling in his arms to go back. "Papa's papers!" Mateo held her tight, his own heart breaking. "There's no time, child. Your life is worth more than any paper." They stumbled toward the tree line, where Henry provided a steady, covering fire, driving the attackers back into the darkness. And then the three of them could only watch, helpless, as the flames devoured the cabin. The roof collapsed with a thunderous, final crash, sending a geyser of sparks and burning embers high into the night sky. Ava sobbed against Mateo's chest as her home, the home they had just rebuilt with their own hands, burned for the second time. The deed, the map, her father's careful markings of the spring, all of it consumed by the merciless fire. Mateo felt hollow, empty, cursed. Once again he had failed to protect a home. Once again he had failed to shield a child from devastating loss. Henry appeared beside them, a silent shadow, his rifle still warm. "Railroad men," he said grimly. "I saw their horses, the same ones who were watching at the service." Mateo's jaw clenched. Of course, they had waited until the townspeople had left, until the cabin was vulnerable again. A swift, merciless, cowardly strike to erase Ava's claim, and their hope forever. The fire burned hot and fast, fed by the seasoned wood and the relentless winter wind. By midnight, only the stone chimney stood, a dark, skeletal finger pointing accusingly at the star-filled sky. Smoke and ash filled the air, stinging their eyes, coating the pristine white snow with a layer of gray filth. They huddled together as the temperature dropped, sharing Henry's single blanket. Mateo held Ava close, trying to transfer his own body heat to her shivering form. Her tears had finally dried, leaving clean tracks in the soot that smudged her cheeks. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I'm so sorry, little one." "It's not your fault," she mumbled, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "You tried to save it." Her simple, undeserved absolution cut deeper than any blame would have. Mateo looked at the smoking ruins of the cabin, their refuge, their fortress of hope, their chance at a family. Now it was nothing but smoldering timber. The sight brought back that other terrible night with a suffocating intensity. The night when flames had taken his wife and daughter. A different cabin, but the same crushing, soul-destroying grief. Henry stood watch through the long, dark hours, his figure a stoic silhouette against the fading embers. He would occasionally disappear into the trees, checking for any returning attackers. But the railroad men had accomplished their goal. They had no reason to return. The wind died as a false dawn crept over the mountains. The temperature plummeted further, freezing their clothes stiff with sweat and melted snow. They had nothing. No food, no shelter, no proof of Ava's inheritance. Even the Bible, her last physical link to her parents, now lay somewhere in those gray ashes. Matteo felt the full weight of his failure pressing down, crushing the air from his lungs. He had dared to hope again. He had dared to believe in something bigger than his own survival. And now that hope lay in ruins, just like the cabin. He was cursed, cursed to watch homes burn, cursed to lose family over and over again. Ava stirred in his arms as the true dawn finally broke, painting the eastern sky with pale and different colors. Her face was ashen with cold and exhaustion, but her eyes, when they met his, held something he couldn't name. Not quite defeat, not quite defiance. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly, her voice a fragile thread of sound. Matteo had no answer. He had nothing left. They sat in silence as the sun rose over the smoking, desolate ruins. Three broken souls lost in a wilderness of grief, unsure where to turn, their breath frosting in the bitter morning air. Henry finally spoke, his voice carrying the quiet, enduring weight of generations who had faced similar, devastating losses. "The land remains," he said, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks. "The spring still flows. Papers burn, but the truth does not." Mateo looked at him sharply, but the Apache's face revealed nothing more. They huddled closer as the day brightened, surrounded by destruction, yet somehow still breathing, still together. The cabin was gone, but something else, something fierce and unbreakable, had been forged in its flames, something that even fire couldn't touch. The sun climbed higher, casting long, mournful shadows across the snow-covered clearing. Where the cabin had stood, thin wisps of smoke still rose from the ruins, carrying with them the ashes of their dreams. But as Mateo held Ava close, feeling the steady, stubborn beat of her heart against his chest, he knew that paper wasn't the only way to prove a claim. Sometimes the truth lived in the heart, passed down through love and memory, stronger than any written word. They sat together beside the smoldering ruins, cold and broken, yet not entirely without hope. The spring still flowed, somewhere up on that mountain, waiting to be found again. The truth of Ava's inheritance still lived in their memories, and in the hearts of the townspeople who had gathered just yesterday to worship and to witness. But for now, they could only wait as the morning painted the sky in watercolor hues of a new uncertain day. Their future was as fragile and as unpredictable as smoke in the wind. The trek back to Mateo's line shack was a long and bitter pilgrimage through the morning hours. Each step felt heavier than the last as they pushed through the knee-deep, ash-dusted snow. The wind had picked up again, a merciless force that drove icy needles into their faces and numbed their hands and feet. Ava stumbled between Mateo and Henry, her small frame racked with violent shivers. Her dress, still damp from the night's firefighting, had frozen stiff in places, crackling with every movement. Dark, bruised circles shadowed her eyes, a testament to their sleepless, terrifying vigil by the burning cabin. "Here now," Mateo said gruffly, his voice cracking, stopping in his tracks. "Come up, little one." He bent down and scooped Ava into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a fragile bundle of bones and blankets, her body trembling violently against his chest. The simple act of holding her brought back sharp, agonizing memories of carrying his own daughter through mountain storms, memories that cut like knives. Henry took the lead, breaking a trail through the deepest drifts with his steady, relentless pace. The Apache moved with a quiet, tireless efficiency, his eyes constantly scanning, checking their back trail to ensure no one followed. Though the railroad men had accomplished their destruction, there was no telling if they might still be lurking in the timber, waiting to finish the job. Mateo's arms ached with a dull, throbbing pain as they climbed the last ridge toward his shack. Ava had dozed off despite the biting cold, her breath a shallow, ragged whisper against his neck. Guilt, sharp and corrosive, gnawed at his insides. He should have posted a better watch. He should have known the railroad wouldn't let them be after the public defiance of the church service. He should have been smarter, stronger, better. The words beat a merciless rhythm in his mind, in time with his labored steps. The sight of his small lined shack, hunched against the wind like a worn-out old dog, had never been so welcome. Henry hurried ahead to break a path to the door and get a fire started. Mateo followed in his tracks, careful not to jostle Ava awake. Inside, the shack was as cold as a tomb. While Henry worked with flint and steel, his movements quick and sure, Mateo gently settled Ava on his narrow bunk, wrapping her in every blanket he owned. Her face was as pale as milk, except for two bright, alarming spots of fever on her cheeks. The night's terror and the brutal cold had taken their toll. "She needs warming, and quick," Henry said, his voice grim as he fed kindling into the stove. "Do you still have that coffee?" Mateo nodded, finding the tin of grounds tucked away on a high shelf. His hands shook so badly he spilled some of the precious grounds on the floor. The familiar, mundane routine helped to steady him, but it couldn't quiet the raging storm in his mind. What were they to do now? The cabin was gone. All proof of Ava's claim was gone, turned to ash. They couldn't hide in this shack forever. The railroad men, with the full power of the deputy behind them, would find them eventually. The stove began to radiate a welcome warmth as the coffee bubbled and steamed in the pot. Henry had settled on a stool by the door, his rifle resting across his knees, his eyes fixed on the trail outside. Mateo paced the worn floorboards, his thoughts growing darker with each turn. "Maybe," he began, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. He stopped, unable to say it. He took a deep breath and forced the words out. "Maybe the county orphanage would be safer for her. Just until—" No. Ava's voice, though weak and hoarse, carried a core of pure steel. She had pushed herself up on the bunk, the blankets falling away from her shoulders. "Please," she whispered, her eyes pleading with him. "Please don't send me away." Mateo couldn't meet her gaze. He turned away, staring at the rough log wall. "Child, these men mean business. They've already burned one home. I can't protect you proper. Not from all of them." "You can't give up," Ava insisted, her lower lip trembling, but her gaze holding firm. "Papa always said, the spring of the righteous will not run dry." He said it over and over, especially when Mama got sick. He believed it, right to the very end. A hot wave of shame flooded Mateo's chest. Here he was, a grown man, a mountain man, ready to surrender, ready to run. And this slip of a girl, sick with fever and grief, was showing more raw faith and courage than he'd managed to find in years. He turned away, busying himself with the coffee pot, unable to face the unwavering trust in her eyes. "Your father was wise to believe so strongly," Henry said quietly from his post by the door. He set his rifle aside and reached into an inside pocket of his jacket, pulling out a worn leather pouch that had seen better days. He was also wise enough to know the darkness in men's hearts, and to plan for it. Mateo looked up sharply, a flicker of something he dared not name stirring in his chest. Henry carefully opened the pouch, his long, deft fingers withdrawing several folded papers, yellowed with age, but clean and intact. "What is that?" Mateo asked, his voice a hoarse whisper, though something deep in his soul already knew. "Copies," Henry said simply, "of the water filings, the spring survey, the deed." He nodded toward Ava, his dark eyes filled with a deep respect. "Your father brought them to me 3 summers ago. He said he feared foul play. He wanted them kept safe on reservation land, where the white man's greed rarely reaches." Mateo stared at the papers, hardly daring to breathe. Hope, that dangerous, fragile ember he'd thought was extinguished forever, flickered back to life in his chest. Ava's eyes had gone wide, her fever-bright gaze fixed on the documents. "Papa? Papa trusted you with these?" Henry nodded solemnly. "He was a good man, your father. He treated my people with fairness and respect. He shared the water rights from his lower well when others would fence them off. He said the spring was a gift from the Creator, meant for all his children, not just some." He held the papers out to Mateo with a careful, almost reverent gesture. "These are not just copies. These are the originals he filed with the territory office before he ever built the cabin. These copies bear the same stamps, the same signatures. They are legal. They are binding." Mateo's hands shook as he took the papers. The territorial seal was there, clear as day. The surveyor's mark, the witness signatures, everything, everything they needed to prove Ava's claim, miraculously preserved by one man's incredible foresight and another's unwavering loyalty. Why? Mateo asked, his voice rough with a mix of awe and disbelief. Why didn't you tell us you had these before? I needed to be sure first, Henry replied, his gaze steady and clear. Sure of your heart, sure that you would stand with her when the real trouble came. He allowed himself a faint, rare smile. Now I know. You proved it in the fire. Ava slipped from the bunk, the blankets trailing behind her like a queen's robes. She crossed the small space to Henry and threw her thin arms around his neck, pressing her face into his shoulder. Thank you, she whispered, her voice choked with tears. Thank you for keeping Papa's trust. The Apache's usually stoic expression softened as he gently patted her back. Your father was my friend, he said simply. His dream of sharing the waters must not die. Mateo sank onto a stool, the precious papers trembling in his grasp. Just hours ago, they had watched all their hope turn to ash and smoke. And now Providence had handed them a second chance, delivered through the faithful hands of an Apache scout who had kept his word when all others had failed. God has not abandoned us, Ava said, her voice still muffled against Henry's shoulder. Just like Papa said, the spring still flows. Mateo looked at the child, this remarkable, resilient, incredible child who had lost everything, yet had never, not for one moment, lost her faith. A powerful wave of shame and gratitude washed over him. He had been ready to give up, ready to send her away, while all along, God had already prepared their deliverance through the quiet, steadfast loyalty of his friend Henry. The line shack slowly warmed as the morning crept toward noon. Hot coffee steamed in their cups, and some color began to return to Ava's cheeks as she huddled near the stove, wrapped in blankets. The papers lay safe on the table, a tangible promise that justice might yet prevail. Mateo watched as Ava and Henry shared a quiet conversation, the Apache teaching her a few words in his native tongue, while she giggled at the strange, beautiful sounds. Something had shifted in the small shack, something far more profound than the mere preservation of legal documents. Hope had returned, yes, but more than that, trust had been proven. Faith had been rewarded. A friendship that had been forged in shared hardship was now tempered into something unbreakable in the crucible of loss. The cabin was gone, but perhaps they had gained something even more valuable. The absolute certainty that they did not and would not stand alone. Mateo wrapped his cold hands around his coffee cup, letting its warmth seep into his bones. The road ahead would not be easy. Mitchell and his men would not give up their plans without a bloody fight. But now they had a chance. More than a chance. They had the truth, preserved against all odds. They had a friendship, proven in fire, and they had a child's unwavering faith to light their way. The morning wore on as they rested and recovered, safe for the moment in the shelter of Mateo's humble shack. Outside, the snow continued to fall, a soft, white curtain covering the tracks of their desperate retreat. And inside, three unlikely allies shared warmth, coffee, and the quiet, certain knowledge that Providence had not finished with them yet. Dawn painted the frozen valley in shades of rose and amber as Mateo saddled his mule. The morning air bit sharp and clean, his breath rising in thick white clouds. Henry waited astride his pony, patient and silent as always. Mrs. Patterson, a kind-faced widow from the next homestead over, had arrived just after sunrise to watch Ava, bringing a basket of fresh biscuits and a warm smile. You be careful now, Ava said, her small arms wrapped tightly around Mateo's waist before he mounted. Her face was pinched with a worry that was far too old for her years. Don't you fret none, Mateo assured her, gently patting her shoulder. We'll be back before dark. They set out at a steady pace, their horses' hooves crunching through the crusted snow. The trail wound through silent stands of pine and over rocky, windswept ridges. Frozen creeks glinted like broken glass in the early morning light. Mateo hunched deeper into his coat, grateful for the thick wool scarf Ava had insisted he wear. Your girl has a good heart, Henry observed quietly after they had ridden in silence for nearly an hour. Mateo nodded, surprised at how natural and right it felt to hear Ava called his girl. That she does. Stronger than mine, truth be told. They crossed 3 ice-choked streams before finally reaching the boundary of the reservation. The agency building squatted on a low hill, a weather-beaten structure of rough-hewn logs and a rusty tin roof, smoke curling from its stone chimney. Inside, a government clerk looked up from his ledger, his face weary. Recognition flickered across his weathered features when Henry explained their business. "Wittam's papers?" he said, his voice a low rumble. "Yes, I remember that day. Clear as spring water. An honorable man, that one. Always dealt square with us." The clerk disappeared into a back room, the sound of shuffling papers echoing in the quiet office. He returned a moment later with a leather packet wrapped in oilcloth. "Kept these safe just as he asked," the clerk said, his voice filled with respect. "Knew someday they'd matter." He handed them to Henry with a careful, reverent gesture. It's good to know his child survived. The spring should flow as he wished it to. Matteo marveled at the depth of Ava's father's foresight, at how many different hands had helped to preserve his dream. Thomas Whittam had known the risks he was taking, and he had planted seeds of protection in the most fertile, unexpected soil. The return journey proved to be more treacherous than their morning ride. Near Wolf Creek Pass, where the trail narrowed to a thin ribbon on the edge of a steep drop, Henry raised his hand in a silent warning. Matteo reined in, his ears straining, and then he heard it too, the sound of horses ahead. Around the bend, 4 of the railroad's hired men blocked the narrow trail, their rifles held ready across their saddles. Matteo's hand crept toward his own weapon, but Henry made a slight, calming gesture with his hand. "Wait." The Apache's calm, steady presence was an anchor in the sudden storm of Matteo's racing heart. "It is a long ride from town," Henry observed mildly, his voice as calm as if he were commenting on the weather. The railroad men shifted uneasily in their saddles. Their leader, a hard-faced man Matteo recognized from the town saloon, spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Accidents are bound to happen," he sneered, "the way you boys ride these dangerous trails." "Many eyes watch these paths," Henry replied. His voice remained gentle, but there was an underlying current of steel in his tone that made the horses stamp nervously. "Apache eyes, town eyes, God's eyes too, some might say." A tense, heavy silence stretched between them. Matteo felt sweat freeze beneath his collar despite the cold. He knew that one wrong move, one twitch of a finger, and bullets would fly. Finally, the leader jerked his head at his men. "Let's ride, boys, there will be another time." They wheeled their horses around, their movements jerky and angry, and vanished back into the timber. Matteo released a shaky breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "That was too close." "Not close enough for them," Henry said, his eyes still fixed on the trail ahead. "They fear witnesses more than they fear God." They pushed their horses hard through the rest of the afternoon, taking lesser-known back trails whenever possible. The sun was settling toward the jagged peaks when they finally spotted the welcome sight of smoke rising from Matteo's chimney. At the sound of their hooves, Ava burst from the door, running through the deep snow to meet them. "You're back!" she cried, colliding with Matteo as he dismounted, her small body nearly knocking him over. "Mrs. Patterson let me help make soup, and I've been praying for you all day." She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening at the sight of the leather packet Henry was carefully withdrawing from inside his coat. "Are those your father's papers?" Matteo confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "Safe and sound." Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, her face wreathed in a relieved smile. "Thank the Lord you made it back. Come on in where it's warm. The soup is hot and ready." Inside, they gathered around Matteo's small table while Henry unwrapped the packet. The papers were yellowed with age, but pristine, perfectly protected by the oilcloth and by the faith of good men. Matteo ran his fingers over the territorial seal, the crisp signatures, the careful surveys marking the spring's location and flow. "We'll ride to the county seat tomorrow," he declared, his voice ringing with a new, unshakable determination. "We'll get these before the judge. Proper and legal." He looked at Ava, his heart swelling with a love so fierce it almost hurt. "It's time to make your father's dream real, little one." Ava beamed, a pure, radiant hope shining in her eyes. a light as bright and as constant as the evening star. And Matteo felt an answering determination rise in his own chest. They had the truth in their hands now, and come morning, they would see justice done. Dawn mist clung to the valley as Matteo hitched the wagon. Frost sparkled on the leather reins and the wooden seat boards, glittering like a million tiny diamonds. He had borrowed the rig from Mrs. Patterson, knowing the long journey to the county seat would be too hard for Ava on horseback. The girl sat wrapped in quilts on the seat beside him, her small hands twisting the edge of her shawl, her body fidgeting with a mixture of excitement and nerves. Henry rode ahead on his pony, a silent, watchful scout, his eyes scanning the trail for any trouble. The preacher, having heard the news, brought up the rear in his own buggy, his presence a comforting reassurance. The precious original papers lay secured in oilskin beneath the wagon seat, protected from the damp morning air. "Will the judge be very fierce?" Ava asked, her small voice wavering in the quiet morning. "I reckon he'll be fair," Matteo answered, though his own stomach was churning with a nervous energy. "And that's all we need, little one. Fairness and the truth." The wagon wheels creaked over the frozen ruts as they followed the winding road down from the high country. Ava chattered steadily, a nervous stream of questions about the courthouse, the town, whether the judge would let her speak. Matteo answered what he could, his responses growing shorter as his own anxiety mounted with every mile that passed. By late afternoon, when the sun hung low and golden in the western sky, they reached the Wayside Inn. It was a weathered, two-story building with a busy stable yard and cooking fires already burning. Other travelers milled about, leading their tired horses and unloading their wagons for the night. The innkeeper's wife brought them bowls of hot, savory stew and thick slabs of cornbread. They gathered in the common room, grateful for the warmth of the roaring hearth, but Matteo noticed the sideways glances, the abruptly silenced conversations. He saw two men near the door, their coats bearing the unmistakable badge of the railroad company. "They are following us," Henry murmured, settling onto the bench beside Matteo. "3 riders have been shadowing us since noon." The preacher nodded grimly, his face etched with worry. "The railroad will not let this pass without a fight." Matteo watched Ava as she spooned up her stew, her face glowing with the adventure of it all, blissfully innocent of the very real danger that surrounded them. His throat tightened. Silently, he prayed for the strength to see her through whatever was to come. They rose before first light, pressing on through a thick morning fog that clung to the lowlands. By midday, the courthouse rose before them, a stern, imposing brick building with tall white columns and high-arched windows. Matteo helped Ava down from the wagon, his hands steadying her when her legs wobbled from the long, jarring ride. Inside, the courtroom smelled of old wood polish and stale pipe smoke. Their boots echoed on the worn wooden floors as they took their places on the hard benches. The judge, a gray-haired man with keen, intelligent eyes, studied them from his high bench. The railroad lawyers, dressed in fine city suits, sneered openly when Matteo, in his rough buckskins, stood to present their case. "The girl is clearly confused, Your Honor," one of the lawyers declared, his voice dripping with condescension. "No proof exists that she is who she claims to be, or that these supposed documents are authentic. If it please the court," the preacher stood, his well-worn Bible in his hand. "I knew Thomas Wedham. He was a man of God and a man of his word. He spoke often of his dream of ensuring the spring would benefit all the people of this valley, not just the powerful. These papers prove his intent." Henry stepped forward next, his quiet, commanding dignity filling the room with a palpable authority. "I witnessed the filing of these documents with the territorial agent," he said, his voice calm and clear. "Thomas Whittam trusted me to preserve them, knowing that other, lesser men might try to steal his daughter's birthright." Matteo spoke last, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't hide. "Your Honor, I've watched this child survive a winter alone in the mountains. I've seen her faith shame the doubts of grown men. That spring is her legacy, and I aim to see she keeps it." Finally, Ava herself rose to her feet. Though she barely reached the height of the witness rail, her voice when she spoke rang clear and true through the silent courtroom. "My father said the spring was God's gift," she said, her eyes fixed on the judge's face. "He said it was meant to bless everyone. I just want to honor his dream, sir. Please, please help me make it real." The judge examined the filings carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration, turning each page with a deliberate, slow attention. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. At last he looked up, his gaze sweeping over them all. "This court requires careful consideration of all evidence presented," he announced, his voice grave. "I will deliver my ruling tomorrow morning, at 9 o'clock. They found rooms at the hotel across the street. That night, none of them slept much. Mateo paced the floor of their small room, while Ava curled in an oversized chair, clutching her father's Bible. The preacher sat in a corner, his head bowed, his lips moving in silent prayer. And Henry stood watch at the window, his tall silhouette a sharp, dark shape against the starlit sky. Tomorrow would bring either triumph or heartbreaking defeat. For now they could only wait and hope and pray. The courthouse buzzed with a tense, electric energy as the morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows. Townspeople from Pine Creek, who had made the journey to witness the verdict, pressed shoulder to shoulder with the stony-faced railroad men in the crowded gallery. Judge Harrison entered, his black robe sweeping behind him as he took his seat. A heavy silence fell over the room. "Having reviewed all the evidence and testimony," the judge's voice rang out, clear and decisive, "I find the water rights filings of Thomas Whittam to be legal, binding, and properly recorded. His daughter, Ava Whittam, as his sole surviving heir, holds rightful and legal claim to the spring and the surrounding land." A wave of joy and anger exploded through the room. The townspeople cheered. Deputy Darnell's face twisted into a mask of pure rage. His hand flew to his gun, but Mateo, who had been watching him, moved faster. One solid, well-aimed punch sent the deputy sprawling, his weapon clattering across the floor. Two lawmen rushed forward, pinning the sputtering Darnell to the ground. "He's been taking railroad money," someone from the gallery shouted. "I've seen it myself." Ava squeezed Mateo's hand, her small face glowing with a joy so pure it was almost painful to see. Henry placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "The spirits of your ancestors smile today," he said softly. "Justice has found its path." That evening, gathered around the rough table in Mateo's now crowded line shack, Ava bowed her head. "Thank you, Lord," she prayed, her voice thick with happy tears. "Thank you for giving us strength, and thank you for making us a family." Mateo's quiet amen followed, his own heart finally, blessedly, at peace. The spring thaw came early that year, softening the mountain paths as new life stirred in the valley. The sound of hammers and saws echoed through the clearing where Ava's cabin had once stood. The townspeople, united by the court's decision, had come to help rebuild. They worked side by side, passing logs and raising walls under the warming sun. Mateo stood watching Ava as she scampered up a ladder with a bundle of shingles, her bright laughter mixing with the song of the birds. As dusk painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, the lantern light danced across the fresh-cut timber of the new, stronger cabin. The preacher raised his hands over the completed home. "Let this be a house of mercy," he declared, his voice filled with emotion, "a place where all may find welcome, and a testament to the power of faith." Mateo stepped forward, his own voice thick and unsteady. "I aim to adopt Ava, proper and legal, to make her my daughter-in-law as she already is in my heart." "Pa!" Ava cried, flinging herself from the bottom rung of the ladder and into his arms. Tears of joy streaked her dusty cheeks as she held him tight. Henry came and stood beside them, placing a hand on Mateo's shoulder. "You have my word as kin," he said softly. "I will always be near." Later that night, sitting beside the crackling fire in their new home, Mateo knelt in prayer, a feeling of overwhelming gratitude washing over him. Ava slept peacefully in her new bed, while outside the clear, pure water of her father's spring trickled its endless, gentle song. The cabin, once broken and lost to fire and greed, now stood as a testament to a love that had been restored and a family that had been reborn. Stories like this connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark of connection today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new story every single day, and the next one just might be the one that changes your day. Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today.